262 years before the birth of Christ, 40,000 Roman soldiers stood in formation on the sun-scorched plain outside the ancient city of Agrigentum on the southern coast of Sicily. The consuls Lucius Postumius Megellus and Quintus Mamilius Vitulus had led their legions here in the heat of summer, arriving in June with a simple mission: besiege this Carthaginian stronghold, starve it into submission, and advance Roman control over this strategic island that had suddenly become the centre of Mediterranean power politics. For 5 months they had maintained their siege lines, encircling the city with ditches and fortifications, waiting for hunger to do what their swords could not. Inside Agrigentum, Hannibal Gisco commanded the garrison, and the 50,000 civilians who had fled from the countryside seeking protection behind the city's walls. By November, the supplies were running desperately low. The situation had become dire enough that Gisco sent urgent messages to Carthage, appeals for immediate relief. What arrived would change Roman military thinking forever. The ship that brought news to the Roman camp in late November reported something that initially seemed like a tactical problem, but would prove to be a psychological nightmare. Carthage had dispatched a massive relief force under the command of Hanno, consisting of 50,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 60 war elephants. Wikipedia History of War. The elephants were the detail that made veteran centurions pause in their briefings. Most of the Roman soldiers had never seen an elephant. Some had heard stories from the older veterans, men who had fought against Pyrrhus of Epirus 3 decades earlier, but those battles belonged to a different generation. The vast majority of the legionaries encamped outside Agrigentum were facing their first major campaign. They were farmers and tradesmen, citizens fulfilling their military obligation to the Republic. They understood formations, they knew how to throw a pilum, they could fight with gladius and shield in the tight disciplined ranks that had made Rome master of the Italian peninsula. But nothing in their training had prepared them for elephants. To understand why this moment mattered, you need to understand what these animals represented. The elephants used by Carthage were North African forest elephants, now extinct, standing approximately 2 to 2.5 meters tall at the shoulder. Wikipedia. They were smaller than the Asian elephants that Alexander the Great had encountered in India, and significantly smaller than the modern African bush elephants that roam the savannas today. But size is relative, and to a Roman soldier who had never seen anything larger than a horse or an ox, these creatures were monsters. Each elephant was guided by a mahout, a trained handler who sat on the animal's neck and directed it with voice commands and a hooked goad. The primary function of these elephants was to terrify the opposition, with fear being the beast's strongest weapon in war history. They were used to charge enemy lines, to scatter cavalry, and to create chaos where discipline had previously reigned. The Romans had encountered war elephants before, though most of the men now besieging Agrigentum had not been there. In 280 BC, King Pyrrhus of Epirus had brought 20 elephants to Italy, using them devastatingly at the Battle of Heraclea, where they routed the Roman Cavalry University of Chicago. Wikipedia. The Roman horses, having never encountered such creatures, had panicked at their sight, smell, and thundering trumpet calls, carrying their terrified riders from the battlefield. The elephants' huge bulk and ugliness, combined with their strange smell and trumpeting, proved overwhelming to Roman forces unprepared for such adversaries. University of Chicago. At Asculum the following year, the Romans had tried to counter the elephants with specially prepared wagons, equipped with hooks and torches, but the tactic had failed. Pyrrhus had won again, though at such cost that the phrase Pyrrhic victory entered the vocabulary of warfare. By the time the Romans finally defeated Pyrrhus at Beneventum in 275 BC, they had learned that elephants could be beaten, but at Agrigentum in 262 BC, that institutional knowledge resided primarily in the memories of aging officers. The bulk of the army had never faced these weapons of psychological warfare. Sicily itself had become the flashpoint for conflict almost by accident, the way great wars often begin from small disputes that spiral beyond anyone's control. In 289 BC, a group of Italian mercenaries known as the Mamertines had seized the city of Messana on Sicily's northeastern tip. Wikipedia. For decades they had controlled that strategic location, essentially operating as bandits and pirates, raiding the surrounding territory. When Hiero II of Syracuse decided to eliminate this menace in 265 BC, the Mamertines did what desperate people do. They called for help. They appealed to both Carthage and Rome, and both powers responded, each seeing an opportunity to establish influence on an island that controlled sea routes and grain supplies crucial to Mediterranean commerce. Carthage arrived first, establishing a garrison in Messana. But the Mamertines, finding Carthaginian protection uncomfortably similar to Carthaginian domination, turned to Rome. The Roman Senate debated the request extensively. Many senators argued against intervention, noting the moral inconsistency of helping mercenaries who had stolen a city from its rightful inhabitants. But the prospect of Carthage controlling a position so close to Italy, combined with the promise of plunder from what many assumed would be a quick campaign, ultimately swayed the popular assembly to vote for intervention. Wikipedia. In 264 BC, the consul Appius Claudius Caudex crossed to Sicily with Roman legions. The Mamertines, emboldened by approaching Roman support, expelled the Carthaginian garrison from Messana. Carthage executed the garrison commander for his failure, a brutal reminder of what defeat meant in Carthaginian service. The First Punic War had begun, named for the Latin word punicus, meaning Phoenician, which is what the Romans called the Carthaginians, who traced their ancestry to Phoenician colonists from Tyre. The early fighting went surprisingly well for Rome. They defeated both Syracuse and Carthaginian forces near Messana, and Hiero II, recognizing Rome as the stronger power, switched sides and became a Roman ally. This diplomatic victory gave Rome a secure base and supply source on the island. Flush with early success and seeking to capitalize on momentum, the Roman Senate decided to strike at the heart of Carthaginian power in Sicily. Agrigentum, located on the southern coast, was the main Carthaginian base on the island, commanding trade routes and serving as the headquarters for Carthaginian military operations. Agrigentum occupied an exceptionally defensible position. The city sat on a plateau 2.5 miles from the sea, surrounded by steep slopes on all sides except the west. The Hypses River protected the western approach, while the Acragus River guarded the eastern side. Wikipedia. Natural barriers meant attackers could only approach from the west, funneling any assault into a narrow avenue that defenders could easily control. The city commanded critical routes along the southern coast and paths leading north and east to other Sicilian cities. Its strategic importance made it essential for anyone seeking to dominate Sicily. When the Roman consuls arrived in June of 262 BC with 40,000 men, Hannibal Gisco, the Carthaginian commander, made the prudent decision. He pulled all civilians from the surrounding countryside into the city, swelling Agrigentum's population to 50,000. He brought in every available supply from the farms and estates, preparing for a lengthy siege. Then he closed the gates and waited for help from Carthage. The Romans began the methodical work of siege warfare. They dug a network of ditches and built small forts encircling the city, establishing a double line of fortifications that would both contain the garrison and protect Roman forces from any relief army that might arrive. The first months of the siege passed in relative stalemate. The Romans held their positions, harvesting crops from the surrounding fields that the Carthaginians had been forced to abandon. Carthaginian forces made occasional sorties, attacking Roman foraging parties and inflicting casualties on soldiers caught unprepared in the fields. But these skirmishes couldn't break the siege. As summer turned to autumn and autumn approached winter, conditions inside Agrigentum deteriorated. Food stores dwindled. 50,000 people consume enormous quantities of supplies, and as November arrived, Gisco realized he was running out of time. He sent urgent appeals to Carthage, communicating the desperate situation and requesting immediate relief. Carthage, understanding that losing Agrigentum would effectively mean losing Sicily, mobilized a massive relief force. The army that Carthage assembled represented one of the largest expeditionary forces the ancient Mediterranean world had seen. Hanno, likely the son of Hannibal, though ancient sources are unclear on this point, commanded the expedition. Ancient historians provide varying accounts of the army's composition. Polybius stated the force included about 50 elephants, Numidian cavalry and mercenaries, while other sources report 50,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 60 elephants. Wikipedia History of War. Whatever the exact numbers, this was an enormous army by the standards of the time, representing a massive commitment of Carthaginian resources and manpower. The elephants in this force had been captured from the wild populations that still existed in the Atlas Mountains and the forests of North Africa. After fighting Pyrrhus in Sicily between 278 and 276 BC, the Carthaginians realized they could easily acquire African forest elephants which inhabited North Africa in great numbers, the military workshop. It was far easier and cheaper to capture elephants locally than to import them from India, as some Hellenistic kingdoms did. Within a generation, Carthage had built the most powerful elephant corps in the Mediterranean world, with stables in the capital housing up to 300 elephants. These animals had replaced chariots as Carthage's main striking force, psychological weapons designed to break enemy morale and scatter formations. Each elephant carried a single mahout armed with a javelin, though debate continues among historians about whether these smaller African forest elephants carried the towers or howdahs that Asian elephants bore. Some scholarship argues the African forest elephants did not carry howdahs due to the physical limitations of the species, though evidence exists that they were furnished with such structures in certain military contexts. Wikipedia. Hanno's relief force landed at Heraclea Minoa, approximately 25 miles west of Agrigentum, in the late autumn of 262 BC. The timing was deliberate. By arriving in November, Hanno caught the Romans in a vulnerable position. The siege had dragged on for 5 months, and the Romans had been living off the local harvest. Now, with winter approaching, their supply situation became precarious. Hanno moved quickly to exploit this weakness. He captured the Roman supply depot at Hebizos, cutting the supply lines that connected the besieging army to Syracuse and the rest of Roman-controlled Sicily. Suddenly the besiegers found themselves in danger of being besieged. The Romans were now caught between a starving city to their front and a powerful relief army to their rear, with their supply lines severed and disease beginning to spread through their camps due to the deteriorating sanitary conditions of a 5-month siege. The Numidian cavalry that accompanied Hanno's army proved particularly effective at harassing Roman positions. They would ride close to Roman lines, engaging Roman cavalry, and then executing feigned retreats, drawing the Romans into ambushes or leading them into the guns of the main Carthaginian force. Roman cavalry, already nervous about the reported presence of elephants, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by the more mobile Numidian horsemen. For 2 months, from November into early January of 261 BC, this three-way standoff continued. Hanno established his camp at Toros Hill, about a mile from the Roman siege lines, and proceeded to conduct what amounted to a counter-siege. He didn't need to attack the Roman fortifications directly. Time and starvation would do the work for him. Inside Agrigentum, Gisco and his garrison were eating through their last supplies, but now the Romans were in an equally desperate position. The legions had been in the field since June. They were tired, their supplies were cut off, and they faced the prospect of fighting a major battle in the middle of winter while weakened by months of siege operations. Disease had taken its toll, as it always did in prolonged sieges. The close quarters, the stress, the inadequate diet as supplies ran low, all contributed to declining Roman combat effectiveness. The consuls Postumius and Mamilius faced a stark choice. They could try to maintain both the siege of Agrigentum and their defensive positions against Hanno, hoping that Carthaginian supplies would run out first, but this seemed increasingly unlikely. Or they could offer battle, seeking a decisive engagement that would break Hanno's army and allow them to complete the reduction of Agrigentum. It was a calculated risk. Roman strength had always been their disciplined infantry, their ability to maintain formation under pressure and grind out victories through superior organization and staying power. But they would be fighting on unfamiliar terrain against an enemy that included 60 war elephants, weapons specifically designed to shatter infantry formations. The sources for what happened next are fragmentary and contradictory, as ancient sources often are for battles. We have accounts from Polybius, who wrote his histories of the Punic Wars a generation later, based on earlier sources. We have Diodorus Siculus, whose universal history provided another perspective. We have fragments from other ancient historians whose works survive only in quotations by later writers. Each provides slightly different details, and reconciling them into a single coherent narrative requires careful interpretation and acknowledgement of uncertainties. But the broad outlines are clear. The Romans, facing starvation and unable to maintain their position indefinitely, offered battle. Hanno initially refused, seeing no reason to risk a pitched engagement when time was working in his favour. But inside Agrigentum, the situation had become catastrophic. After more than 6 months of siege, the city was close to desperate conditions, with Hannibal Gisco communicating by smoke signals to send urgent pleas for relief, forcing Hanno to accept Battle Fact Index academic kids. If Hanno waited much longer, the garrison he had come to rescue would starve before the Romans did. The Battle of Agrigentum was fought on a winter day in January of 261 BC, the first major pitched battle of the First Punic War, and the first large-scale military confrontation between Rome and Carthage in their long, bitter rivalry. The exact details of the battle's deployment and progression remain matters of historical debate. Hanno apparently deployed his infantry in 2 lines, with the elephants and reinforcements in the second line, and cavalry probably placed on the wings, fact index. The Romans likely organised in their traditional triplex aces formation, 3 lines of infantry that could support each other and maintain pressure on enemy forces through depth and flexibility. This was the tactical system that had won Rome control of Italy, allowing Roman forces to maintain continuous pressure while rotating fresh troops to the front. But no tactical formation in existence had been designed with war elephants specifically in mind. The Roman soldiers who formed up that morning faced an enemy unlike any they had trained to fight. Imagine standing in formation, shield locked with the man beside you, pilum ready, waiting for the command to advance. You've done this before in training, perhaps even in smaller battles against Italian tribes or during the early skirmishing on Sicily. You know what to expect from enemy infantry, from cavalry, from archers. Then the trumpet sounds, and the Carthaginian lines part, and through the gap come the elephants. Contemporary writers noted that the North African elephant was smaller than the Indian elephant, likely similar in size to the modern African forest elephant Wikipedia. But smaller is relative. These animals still stood 8 feet tall at the shoulder, weighed several tons, and moved with a ponderous power that made the ground tremble. Their ears spread wide in displays of aggression. Their trunks swayed, capable of grabbing a man and throwing him aside like a child's toy. Their tusks, though smaller than those of Asian elephants or modern bush elephants, were still formidable weapons that could gore and toss a human body with terrifying ease, and they trumpeted, a sound that carried across the battlefield, alien and frightening to soldiers who had never heard anything like it. Horses panic at the sight and smell of elephants. This is a documented fact from ancient warfare. During Pyrrhus's campaigns, Roman horses refused to approach the elephants, terrified by their huge bulk, ugliness, strange smell, and trumpeting University of Chicago. Untrained horses will bolt, carrying their riders away from the threat no matter how skilled the horseman. The Romans had learned this lesson at Heraclea and Asculum decades earlier. But what about men? Human beings have the advantage over horses of understanding what they're seeing. They can reason, they can override their instincts with discipline and training. Or so the theory goes. In practice, facing a war elephant for the first time tests that discipline to its absolute limit. The battle began with the traditional preliminary skirmishing. Light infantry from both sides, velites for the Romans and various skirmisher troops for the Carthaginians, engaged in missile exchange. Javelins, stones from slings, arrows, all the projectile weapons that opened ancient battles flew between the lines. This phase was familiar to the Roman soldiers, part of the established pattern of combat. Then came the main engagement. Carthaginian infantry, likely positioned in the front line, advanced to meet the Roman legions, the clash of heavy infantry, shield on shield, gladius against spear, the grinding, brutal work of ancient melee combat. This too was familiar. The Romans excelled at this kind of fighting. Their discipline, their ability to fight as a unit rather than as individual warriors, their systematic approach to infantry combat, all of these had consistently defeated more numerous but less organised enemies. But then Hanno committed his second line, and with it came the elephants. The accounts vary in their descriptions of exactly what happened next. Some sources suggest the elephants charged directly into the Roman lines. Others indicate they were used on the flanks to attack the sides and rear of the Roman formation. What all sources agree on is that the elephants' impact was devastating, not through direct casualties necessarily, but through the psychological shock they inflicted. Picture yourself in the Roman line now. You're pressed shoulder to shoulder with your fellow soldiers, maintaining formation, fighting the Carthaginian infantry to your front. You've gained no decisive advantage yet, but you're holding your ground, executing your training, confident in your tactics and your comrades. Then you hear the trumpet calls. Not Roman trumpets, but something else. Something animal and terrifying. You hear shouting from the flanks, panic in voices that moments before had been steady. You hear, though you don't want to admit it to yourself, screaming. Not the battle cries of soldiers, but the screams of men in mortal terror. Then you see it, emerging through the dust and press of combat. A massive grey shape, larger than anything you've ever seen, moving with impossible speed for something so huge. It's coming directly toward your section of the line. You know your training says hold position, maintain formation, trust your shield and your comrades. But your training never mentioned this. Every instinct screams at you to run. Some men do run. Ancient sources consistently report that the mere sight of elephants could break formations, sending soldiers fleeing in panic. The shame of such flight might last a lifetime for those soldiers, but in that moment of terror, survival instinct overrides training and honor. Others hold, gripping their weapons tighter, setting their shields, preparing to face a creature from nightmare. The reality of fighting elephants, as opposed to the terror of first encountering them, involved specific tactics and vulnerabilities that soldiers could exploit if they kept their heads. Elephants were too vulnerable to missile weapons, too slow, and well-trained infantry could successfully deal with them, while their tendency to run amok when panicked could wreak as much havoc among their friends as their foes' war history. The key was hitting them with enough missiles, javelins and arrows primarily, to wound and frighten them. An elephant in pain and panic becomes uncontrollable, potentially stampeding back through its own lines, crushing friend and foe alike. But executing this tactic requires nerve and discipline under circumstances designed to destroy both. The Romans had brought javelins, pila, as their standard equipment. Each legionary carried 2, designed to be thrown at enemy infantry before engaging in melee. Now those javelins found new targets. Officers shouted commands, trying to organize volley fire at the approaching elephants. Some soldiers responded, hurling their pila at the massive targets. Others broke ranks, unable to overcome their terror. The cohesion of the Roman formation, their greatest strength, began to fracture. The battle hung in the balance. Ancient sources suggest the Carthaginian mercenaries in the front line were pushed back onto the elephants, which in turn may have caused disorder in the Carthaginian formation. Fact-indexed academic kids. This is the constant danger of employing elephants in warfare. They're devastating psychological weapons when things go according to plan, but they're incredibly dangerous liabilities if they panic. An elephant can't tell friend from foe when it's wounded and terrified. It will trample anyone in its path, destroy its own side's formations, create chaos that the enemy can exploit. Some historians believe this is exactly what happened at Agrigentum. The Carthaginian infantry, pressed by Roman legions, fell back toward their own second line where the elephants were positioned. The elephants, perhaps wounded by Roman javelins or simply frightened by the chaos of battle, may have stampeded, causing the Carthaginian reserves to panic and flee. But the sources are contradictory on this crucial point. What's certain is that the Romans eventually gained the upper hand. After hard fighting, the Romans discovered the Carthaginian generals' plans for a coordinated attack and attacked Hanno's army from the side and rear, defeating them after a costly battle. Wikipedia. The Carthaginians broke and retreated. The battle won by Rome, but at enormous cost in casualties. The Roman cavalry, having been largely ineffective during the main battle, likely kept at distance from the elephants by their horses' natural fear, now exploited the Carthaginian retreat. They managed to attack the Carthaginian camp and capture several elephants. Wikipedia. This detail is significant. Capturing elephants meant capturing the terror weapons that had nearly broken Roman formations. It meant Roman soldiers, those who had maintained discipline and survived the battle, could now examine these creatures up close, see that they were animals, not demons, mortal and vulnerable despite their size and frightening appearance. But the Roman victory was incomplete. The main objective of the battle had been to destroy Hanno's army, kill or capture its commander, and eliminate the Carthaginian relief force as a threat. Instead, most of Hanno's army escaped. Even more frustrating for the Romans, Hannibal Gisco, the garrison commander whose relief had been the entire point of the battle, managed to break out of Agrigentum during the night. Gisco filled the Roman trenches with straw and escaped with his mercenaries, while the Romans celebrated their tactical victory. Wikipedia. It was a brilliant and daring move, executed while the Roman forces were exhausted from battle and possibly distracted by looting the Carthaginian camp and marvelling at the captured elephants. When the Romans pursued Gisco's force the next morning, they attacked his rear guard but eventually turned back to occupy the now empty Agrigentum. The city's population paid the price for Roman frustration at the escape of the garrison. The Romans plundered Agrigentum and sold 25,000 inhabitants into slavery. Wikipedia. This brutal treatment of a captured civilian population, while common in ancient warfare, had strategic consequences. Other Sicilian cities watching Agrigentum's fate became more determined to resist Roman control. The message sent was clear. Rome would show no mercy to cities that supported Carthage, but that message also hardened opposition, making future sieges more difficult as cities chose to fight to the end rather than hope for clemency and surrender. The Roman consuls who had led this campaign, Postumius and Mamilius, returned to Rome expecting triumph and recognition. They had won a major battle, captured a strategic city, and advanced Roman control over Sicily. But they received no triumph, no celebratory parade through Rome's streets. The consuls were denied their triumph, possibly because of the escape of the Carthaginians and the heavy losses sustained in battle fandom. The Roman Senate's message was clear. Winning at great cost while allowing your primary objectives to escape did not merit Rome's highest military honour. But the Battle of Agrigentum's true significance lay not in its immediate tactical outcome, but in what it taught both sides about the nature of warfare they were beginning. The Romans learned several crucial lessons. First, elephants could be beaten. For all their psychological impact, for all the terror they instilled in soldiers seeing them for the first time, they were not invincible. They were vulnerable to missiles, prone to panic, and dangerous to friend and foe alike when things went wrong. This lesson would prove invaluable in later encounters. Second, the Romans learned that they needed to adapt their tactics and training. The traditional triplex aces formation had proven vulnerable to elephant charges. Future Roman commanders would need to develop specific anti-elephant tactics. They would train soldiers to create gaps in formations, allowing panicked elephants to pass through without disrupting the line. They would emphasize missile weapons and targeted attacks on the vulnerable parts of elephants, their eyes, trunks, and feet. Some commanders would later employ fire and noise, using flaming projectiles and loud instruments to frighten elephants before they could close with Roman lines. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the Romans learned that controlling Sicily would require more than land battles. Carthage's ability to supply and reinforce its positions by sea meant that Rome needed naval power to truly contest control of the island. This realization would lead Rome to undertake one of the most ambitious naval construction programs in ancient history, building a fleet virtually from scratch to challenge Carthaginian naval supremacy. For Carthage, the lessons were different but equally significant. They learned that Rome was a more formidable opponent than the Greek city-states they had fought for centuries in Sicily. Roman legions were disciplined, resilient, and capable of absorbing terrible punishment while maintaining formation. The tactical victory at Agrigentum had come at a cost that Carthage, dependent on mercenary armies, would struggle to sustain. They learned that elephants, while effective psychological weapons, were not war-winning assets on their own. Against experienced or exceptionally disciplined troops, elephants could become liabilities. Future Carthaginian commanders would need to use them more carefully, as part of combined arms tactics rather than as independent shock weapons. They also learned, though this lesson would take longer to fully appreciate, that Rome would not give up. Many powers in the ancient Mediterranean would have negotiated a peace after losing a battle like Agrigentum. Rome simply prepared for the next campaign. This Roman persistence, this unwillingness to accept defeat, would ultimately prove decisive in the long struggle between these two great powers. The war that both sides had probably expected to last a season or two would drag on for 23 years, becoming the longest continuous conflict in ancient history up to that point. It would see massive naval battles, amphibious invasions, sieges, raids, atrocities, and innovations in military technology and tactics. The elephants that had terrified Roman soldiers at Agrigentum would appear again and again in subsequent battles, gradually losing their psychological impact as Roman forces became accustomed to fighting them. The captured elephants from the battle provided an unexpected benefit to Rome. They could be studied, their behaviours observed, their vulnerabilities catalogued. Roman commanders could train units specifically in anti-elephant tactics using these captured animals. Future generations of Roman soldiers would learn about elephants not from panicked accounts of terrified survivors, but from systematic training against actual beasts. Some of these captured elephants would eventually be displayed in Rome, exhibited during triumphs to show the Roman people the exotic weapons their legions had overcome. This practice served dual purposes, celebrating Roman martial prowess while simultaneously demystifying the elephants, turning weapons of terror into curiosities and trophies. In 255 BC, just 7 years after Agrigentum, the Romans would face elephants again when they invaded North Africa. The Spartan mercenary general Xanthippus, hired by Carthage to reorganize their army after early defeats, would use approximately 100 elephants to devastating effect at the Battle of Bagradus River. The elephants would charge the Roman legions on open ground ideal for their deployment, scattering Roman formations and allowing Carthaginian cavalry and phalanx infantry to destroy the Roman army. Only 2,000 Romans from a force of 15,000 would escape that slaughter. The captured consul Marcus Atilius Regulus would be tortured to death, and a storm would destroy most of the rescue fleet, drowning tens of thousands of survivors. But even that catastrophic defeat wouldn't restore elephants to their original psychological supremacy. By 251 BC, at the Battle of Panormus, the Romans had developed effective countermeasures. The consul Lucius Caecilius Metellus would defeat a Carthaginian army that included perhaps 140 elephants, the largest elephant force ever deployed in the Mediterranean theatre. He would do it by entrenching his light troops, ordering them to harass the elephants with missiles while staying behind protective fortifications. The elephants, wounded and frightened, would panic and stampede back through Carthaginian lines, creating chaos that Roman legions would exploit for complete victory. Metellus would capture over 100 elephants that day, taking them to Rome where they would be killed in the circus in public spectacles designed to show Roman dominance over these once fearsome weapons. The Carthaginian mercenaries who fought at Agrigentum came from across the Mediterranean world. Carthage hired Ligurian, Celtic, and Spanish mercenaries for their Sicilian campaign's Wikipedia-detailed pedia. These professionals had their own experience with various forms of warfare, bringing diverse tactics and equipment to Carthaginian service, but they fought for pay, not patriotism, and that fundamental difference in motivation would plague Carthaginian military operations throughout the Punic Wars. Mercenaries fight for victory and loot. They retreat when battles turn against them, they desert when pay is late, they rebel when their employers are weak. Roman legions, composed of citizens with property and status to defend, fought with a commitment that mercenaries couldn't match. This difference in military organization, as much as any tactical or technological factor, would ultimately tip the balance toward Rome. The geography of Sicily made it ideal for the kind of grinding, attritional warfare that would characterize the First Punic War. The island's coastline featured numerous fortified cities that could be supplied by sea, making them nearly impossible to capture without naval supremacy. The interior featured rough terrain that limited the movement of large armies and favoured defensive operations. Neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough that would end the war quickly. Instead, the conflict evolved into years of sieges, raids, and naval battles, each side seeking advantages at the margins while the strategic situation remained largely static. Agrigentum, despite its capture, didn't give Rome control of Sicily. It simply removed one Carthaginian strongpoint among many. The war would continue in Sicily for years, eventually moving to naval theatres where Rome would build a fleet and challenge Carthaginian maritime dominance. The First Punic War would ultimately be decided not by land battles like Agrigentum, but by naval engagements, and Rome's ability to sustain losses that would have broken other powers. Carthage would lose fleet after fleet to storms and battles, but Rome would build replacement fleets, pouring the resources of all Italy into ship construction, determined to win regardless of cost. When the war finally ended in 241 BC with Carthage's defeat, Sicily would become Rome's first overseas province, the beginning of an empire that would eventually dominate the entire Mediterranean. But in January of 261 BC, standing on the battlefield outside Agrigentum, exhausted Roman soldiers couldn't have imagined that outcome. They could only know they had survived their first encounter with war elephants. They had faced the terror weapons of the ancient world and held their ground. They had learned that these massive beasts could bleed, could panic, could be defeated. That knowledge, purchased with Roman blood and courage, would serve their descendants well in the wars to come. The elephants that had trampled through their ranks at Agrigentum were the same species that would cross the Alps with Hannibal 40 years later in the Second Punic War. But by then, Rome would be ready. They would have generations of experience fighting elephants, detailed tactical doctrine for countering them, and psychological preparation that turned terror into calculated risk. The soldiers who faced Hannibal's elephants at the Trebia River in 218 BC would be the intellectual heirs of those who first met them at Agrigentum. They would remember that their grandfathers had fought these beasts and won. The broader context of the Punic Wars reveals a clash not just of armies, but of civilizations and strategic approaches. Carthage was a maritime empire, a thalassocracy built on trade networks and naval power. Their military relied heavily on mercenaries and subject peoples, with a relatively small core of Carthaginian citizens. Their strategy was inherently defensive, seeking to protect their commercial interests and trading posts rather than conquest for its own sake. They fought to maintain the profitable status quo that had made Carthage wealthy. Rome, by contrast, was a militarized society where citizenship and military service were inseparable. Every Roman citizen was a potential soldier, trained from youth in the martial values of the Republic. Roman expansion was driven partly by security concerns, the belief that the best defense was to control potentially hostile territories before they could threaten Rome. But it was also driven by a cultural imperative toward martial glory, the idea that virtues, manly courage and martial excellence was the highest virtue a Roman could display. These fundamentally different approaches to warfare meant the conflict would be fought with different levels of commitment and desperation. Carthage was fighting to protect its trading empire. Rome was fighting to prove its martial superiority and eliminate a rival power. In the end, that difference in motivation mattered as much as any tactical or technological factor. The elephants at Agrigentum were tools, weapons in a broader strategic framework. They represented Carthaginian tactical innovation, the willingness to adopt new weapons and methods that might provide battlefield advantages. But tools alone don't win wars. Wars are won by nations capable of sustaining effort over years or decades, by societies that can absorb horrific losses and continue fighting, by cultures that value the collective goal more than individual survival. Rome possessed these qualities to an extraordinary degree. The Roman capacity for endurance, for accepting defeat and returning stronger, for learning from mistakes and adapting tactics, these were the true weapons that would defeat Carthage. The elephants that seemed so terrifying in 261 BC would become footnotes in a larger story of Roman persistence and ultimate triumph. By the time the Punic Wars finally ended with Carthage's complete destruction, in 146 BC, after 3 brutal conflicts spanning over a century, elephants would be curiosities displayed in triumphs, exotic trophies of Roman victories over distant foes. The terror weapons that had shaken Roman formations outside Agrigentum would be remembered as obstacles Rome had overcome, proof of Roman adaptability and martial excellence. The soldiers who first faced them, those who had held formation despite every instinct screaming for flight, those who had thrown their javelins with shaking hands and prayed to Mars and Jupiter for courage, they had won a victory far more significant than any tactical outcome. They had proven that Rome could face the unknown and survive, that Roman discipline could overcome even supernatural terror. That psychological victory won on a winter battlefield in Sicily 261 years before Christ would echo through Roman military history for centuries to come. The First Punic War would be remembered as the conflict that transformed Rome from an Italian power into a Mediterranean empire. It forced Rome to become a naval power, building fleets that would eventually control the entire Mediterranean. It tested Roman resolve in ways that previous wars against Italian tribes never had. It required sustained effort over decades, massive expenditures of resources and manpower, and the commitment of entire generations to a single strategic goal. Agrigentum was simply the first major test, the first time Rome faced a peer competitor with weapons and tactics that challenged Roman assumptions about warfare. The elephants were the most visible symbol of that challenge, massive and terrifying. But the real challenge was Carthaginian wealth, maritime power, and strategic depth. Rome met that challenge and eventually triumphed. But the victory came at enormous cost and required innovations in Roman military organisation and tactics that would reshape the Republic itself. The war that began with Roman soldiers staring in terror at approaching elephants would end with Rome as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, Carthage defeated and humiliated, and Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica as Roman provinces. The journey from that winter day outside Agrigentum to final victory would take decades and consume hundreds of thousands of lives, but it began with that first encounter, that first test of Roman courage against weapons designed to inspire terror. These soldiers who held their ground that day, who fought despite their fear and maintained formation while elephants charged their lines, they laid the foundation for Roman dominance that would last for centuries. They proved that Rome could adapt, could overcome, could face the unknown and emerge victorious. That was the real legacy of Agrigentum, not the tactical details of formations and casualties, but the demonstration of Roman character under the most extreme pressure imaginable. When Rome would face Hannibal's elephants at Trebia, Trasimene and Cannae decades later, when they would face the even larger Syrian elephants of Antiochus III in Greece and Asia Minor, when they would encounter elephants in nearly every major conflict for the next century, they would remember Agrigentum. They would remember that elephants could be beaten. They would remember that terror was just another obstacle to overcome through discipline, training, and Roman virtues, and remembering they would win. The economic dimensions of the First Punic War, dimensions that became apparent only after Agrigentum, would prove as decisive as any battlefield encounter. Carthage entered the conflict as the wealthier power by far, with centuries of accumulated trading profits, control over silver mines in Spain, and commercial networks spanning from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the eastern Mediterranean. Their treasury could afford to hire the best mercenaries available, men from Gaul, Iberia, Liguria, and Numidia, professional soldiers who had spent their lives perfecting the craft of war. The cost of maintaining these forces was enormous, but Carthage's commercial empire generated revenues sufficient to sustain military operations that would have bankrupted lesser states. Each elephant in Hanno's relief force at Agrigentum represented a significant investment. Capturing wild elephants required specialized knowledge and equipment, corrals built in strategic locations where herds could be driven and trapped, handlers trained over years to work with these dangerous animals. Once captured, elephants needed constant care, enormous quantities of food and water, veterinary attention for injuries and illnesses, and ongoing training to make them useful in combat. A single war elephant might consume the equivalent of what would feed 50 soldiers, making elephant corps incredibly expensive to maintain. Yet Carthage considered this expense worthwhile because of the psychological impact these animals could deliver. Before Agrigentum, that calculation made sense. After Agrigentum, as Rome developed countermeasures and soldiers became accustomed to fighting elephants, the cost-benefit analysis shifted dramatically. Carthage would continue using elephants throughout the Punic Wars, but their effectiveness would decline with each encounter as Roman tactical doctrine evolved to neutralize them. Rome's economic approach to warfare differed fundamentally from Carthage's model. The Republic relied primarily on citizen soldiers who provided their own equipment based on their property classification. The wealthiest citizens, the equites, served as cavalry and provided their own horses. The middle classes formed the heavy infantry, purchasing their own armour, shields, swords, and javelins. Even the poorest citizens served as light infantry or naval rowers, contributing their labour if not their equipment. This system meant that Roman military operations were less expensive in direct monetary terms than Carthaginian campaigns. Rome didn't need to pay salaries to mercenaries or purchase loyalty through bonuses and plunder distributions. Roman soldiers fought for the Republic, for the glory of their families, for the opportunity to advance their political careers through military distinction. The indirect costs were substantial, of course. Farmers serving in legions couldn't tend their fields, meaning agricultural production declined during extended campaigns. Casualties meant the permanent loss of productive citizens whose skills and labour contributed to Rome's economy. Equipment losses required replacement through state expenditures or private purchases, but these costs were distributed across Roman society rather than concentrated in state treasuries, making them more sustainable over prolonged conflicts. The Battle of Agrigentum demonstrated this economic model in action. Rome had mobilized 40,000 citizens for a campaign that lasted 7 months, keeping them in the field through harvest season when their labour was most needed at home. The battle itself inflicted heavy casualties that ancient sources don't precisely quantify, but describe as significant. Yet Rome could sustain these losses and continue the war because the pool of potential soldiers was so large. Every adult male citizen was a potential legionary, and Rome's Italian allies contributed additional manpower through treaty obligations. Carthage, by contrast, needed to recruit replacement mercenaries after Agrigentum, a process that took time and money, and couldn't necessarily replace the experience and unit cohesion lost in battle. The technological dimensions of the conflict became increasingly important as the war progressed beyond Agrigentum. The battle had been fought with traditional weapons and tactics refined over centuries of Mediterranean warfare. Infantry armed with spears, swords, and shields, fighting in close formation where discipline and cohesion determined outcomes. Cavalry armed with javelins and swords, seeking to flank enemy formations or exploit gaps in enemy lines. Light infantry with arranged weapons, javelins, slings and bows, harassing enemy formations and screening the movements of heavy infantry. These were the standard tools of ancient warfare, familiar to every commander and soldier in the Mediterranean world. The elephants represented an exception, a specialized weapon that required specific tactics to deploy effectively and specific countermeasures to defeat. But the broader conflict would soon drive both sides toward genuine technological innovation. Rome's decision to build a fleet would represent the most significant technological challenge the Republic had yet undertaken. The Romans were not a seafaring people. They had some naval experience from coastal defence and limited maritime trade, but nothing approaching Carthage's centuries of accumulated nautical expertise. Carthaginian ships were faster, more manoeuvrable, and crewed by experienced sailors who had spent their lives at sea. Roman ships, when they first launched them in 260 BC, were clumsy by comparison, and Roman crews were barely competent at basic seamanship, let alone naval combat tactics. The famous story, recorded by Polybius, tells how Romans copied a captured Carthaginian quinquereme that had run aground, using it as a template for their first fleet. While building these ships, Roman crews practiced rowing on land, sitting on benches arranged to simulate the interior of a galley, learning the coordinated movements necessary to propel these vessels. The image of Roman soldiers practicing rowing on dry land while shipwrights frantically constructed a fleet speaks to Roman determination and willingness to learn new skills, but it also highlights how completely unprepared Rome was for naval warfare. The Corvus, the boarding bridge that Rome developed to counter Carthaginian naval superiority, represented Roman engineering ingenuity applied to a tactical problem. Unable to match Carthaginian seamanship, the Romans transformed naval battles into infantry engagements. The Corvus was a gangplank with a heavy spike on the end, mounted on a pivot on the bow of Roman ships. When a Roman vessel closed with a Carthaginian ship, the Corvus would drop, the spike driving into the enemy deck and locking the two vessels together. Roman marines would then charge across the bridge, turning the sea battle into the kind of close-quarters, infantry combat where Roman legionaries excelled. This innovation, more than any improvement in Roman seamanship, would allow Rome to challenge Carthaginian naval dominance. The first major naval victory using the Corvus would come at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, just months after Agrigentum, when the consul Gaius Duilius defeated a Carthaginian fleet and became the first Roman commander to celebrate a naval triumph. But these developments lay in the future as survivors of Agrigentum straggled back to their units, and Roman commanders assessed the lessons learned from their first major engagement with Carthage. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw both sides reinforcing their positions in Sicily and preparing for continued conflict. The Romans, having captured Agrigentum, needed to garrison the city and secure their supply lines. The enslaved population provided immediate profit. 25,000 people sold in slave markets would have generated enormous revenues that partially offset the campaign's costs. But the brutality of this mass enslavement hardened Sicilian resistance to Roman rule. Cities that might have negotiated peaceful surrenders now prepared to resist to the last, knowing that Roman victory meant death or slavery for their populations. Carthage, meanwhile, worked to rebuild their army after Hanno's defeat. New mercenaries were recruited from their traditional sources. Numidian cavalry, the finest light horsemen in the Mediterranean, would continue to give Carthage significant advantages in mounted operations. Spanish infantry, tough fighters from the Iberian tribes, would provide reliable heavy infantry to replace losses suffered at Agrigentum. Gallic warriors, massive men who fought with terrifying ferocity even if they lacked the discipline of Roman legionaries, would add shock value to Carthaginian forces. And more elephants would be captured and trained, because despite their mixed performance at Agrigentum, they remained valuable psychological weapons against most opponents. The fact that Romans were learning to counter them didn't eliminate their effectiveness against other enemies or in situations where they could be deployed advantageously. The strategic situation after Agrigentum remained essentially unchanged despite the Roman tactical victory. Carthage still controlled most of Sicily's coastal cities and possessed complete naval superiority. They could move forces anywhere around the island, supplying their garrisons by sea and raiding Roman positions with impunity. Rome controlled the interior and could field larger armies, but without naval power, they couldn't strike at Carthaginian coastal strongholds effectively or prevent Carthaginian reinforcement. The war would necessarily evolve into a contest for naval supremacy, because control of the sea meant control of Sicily, and control of Sicily would determine which power dominated the central Mediterranean. Neither side could know in 261 BC that this war would last another 20 years, would consume hundreds of thousands of lives, would see the largest naval battles in ancient history, and would fundamentally transform both powers. The soldiers who fought at Agrigentum and survived likely expected to return home once Sicily was secured, perhaps within another year or two. Instead, many would serve multiple campaigns, fighting battles across Sicily and in North Africa, watching friends and comrades die in combat, or from the diseases that killed more soldiers than enemy action in ancient warfare. Some would transfer to the new fleets Rome was building, learning to fight at sea, discovering that naval combat brought new terrors to replace the elephants they had faced on land. Storms would prove more deadly than any Carthaginian weapon, drowning entire fleets and tens of thousands of men in disasters that made battlefield casualties seem almost modest by comparison. The human cost of the First Punic War would be staggering by any measure. Modern estimates suggest that Rome lost over 50,000 citizens killed in action during the 23 years of conflict, with many more dying from disease and accidents. Naval disasters alone killed at least 100,000 men, perhaps significantly more depending on which ancient casualty figures are most accurate. Carthage's losses are harder to estimate because their mercenary armies leave less clear records, but contemporary sources suggest they were proportionally similar or higher. Sicily's civilian population paid an even heavier price, caught between two great powers and subjected to repeated campaigns of siege, slaughter, and enslavement. Cities changed hands multiple times, each transfer accompanied by massacres or mass slavery. Agricultural lands were devastated by armies that lived off the countryside, leading to famines that killed civilians in numbers that no ancient source bothered to record. The total death toll from the First Punic War probably exceeded several 100,000 people, an enormous figure for the ancient world's smaller populations. All of this began at Agrigentum, or more precisely, all of this became inevitable once Rome decided to intervene in Sicily, and Carthage decided to resist that intervention. The battle itself was just one moment in a much larger conflict, but it was the moment when both sides learned what they were truly facing. Rome learned that Carthage would fight seriously, would bring powerful forces including exotic weapons to the battlefield, and wouldn't surrender Sicily without a genuine struggle. Carthage learned that Rome was more formidable than the Greek city-states they had fought for centuries, that Roman legions could absorb punishment that would break other armies and still maintain formation, and that Rome's manpower reserves made them a genuinely dangerous opponent. Both sides learned that this war wouldn't be decided quickly or easily, that victory would require sustained effort over years, and that the stakes were higher than control of a single island. This was a contest for dominance in the Western Mediterranean, though neither side fully understood that yet in 261 BC. The question of why these two powers went to war, why they couldn't negotiate a compromise that would have prevented decades of bloodshed, has occupied historians for millennia. Thucydides, writing about the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, famously stated that wars happen because of fear, honour, and interest. All three factors were present in the lead-up to the First Punic War. Rome feared Carthaginian power so close to Italy, seeing Messana as a potential springboard for Carthaginian invasion or interference with Italian affairs. Carthage feared Roman expansion, seeing Rome's intervention in Sicily as the first step toward challenging Carthaginian commercial dominance. Both powers had their honour engaged once fighting began. Rome couldn't back down without appearing weak to the Italian allies whose loyalty depended on Roman military credibility. Carthage couldn't abandon Sicily without losing prestige throughout their commercial empire and emboldening other peoples to challenge Carthaginian authority. And both powers had concrete interests at stake. Sicily's grain production was vital for feeding the growing populations of both Rome and Carthage. Control of Sicilian ports meant control of crucial trade routes. Military. Victory promised plunder and slaves that would enrich the victorious state. Perhaps most importantly, both Rome and Carthage had developed political systems where military success was essential for internal stability. Roman politics revolved around competition for glory through military commands. Senators and aspiring politicians needed military victories to advance their careers, creating a structural pressure toward aggressive foreign policy. Carthage's oligarchic government faced pressure from mercenary armies that expected regular employment and payment, making peace potentially more destabilizing than war. These systemic factors made the conflict difficult to end through negotiation, even when both sides suffered terrible losses. The elephants at Agrigentum symbolized something larger than their tactical impact on a single battle. They represented the exotic, the foreign, the unfamiliar challenges that Rome would face as it expanded beyond the familiar world of Italian warfare. The conflicts that had made Rome master of Italy had been fought against peoples who used similar tactics, similar weapons, and similar organizational structures. The Samnites, the Etruscans, the Gauls who had sacked Rome a century earlier, all had been formidable opponents, but they fought in ways that Romans understood. Carthage was different, a power that drew on military traditions from across the Mediterranean and beyond. The elephants came from Africa, the Numidian cavalry came from the deserts south of Carthage, the Spanish infantry came from Iberia, the tactical doctrines combined Phoenician naval traditions, Greek phalanx tactics adapted from Sicilian Greek cities, and indigenous African fighting methods. Roman soldiers facing this cosmopolitan military at Agrigentum were seeing a preview of the wider world they would encounter as Rome expanded. The elephants were just the most dramatic example of the strange and terrifying things that existed beyond Rome's limited sphere of experience. Learning to face elephants without panic was really learning to face the unknown without panic, to maintain Roman discipline and confidence regardless of how unfamiliar the enemy or how exotic their weapons. This psychological adaptation was as important as any tactical lesson about how to counter elephants specifically. It transformed the Roman military mindset from one focused on local Italian conflicts to one capable of conceiving global ambitions. The famous Roman military historian Vegetius, writing centuries after the Punic Wars, emphasized the importance of training and discipline over individual courage or tactical brilliance. His work Epitome Rei Militaris argued that properly trained soldiers could overcome any opponent through systematic application of doctrine and unwavering maintenance of formation. This philosophy, though articulated much later, describes the Roman military system that emerged during the Punic Wars. The soldiers who held formation at Agrigentum, despite seeing elephants for the first time, exemplified this ideal. They weren't necessarily braver than soldiers from other cultures, but they were better trained and more thoroughly indoctrinated in Roman military values. They understood that breaking formation meant death, both for themselves and for their comrades who depended on them to maintain the line. They had practiced the specific movements required to maintain cohesion under pressure, the small, precise steps that kept shields locked and spears presented. When elephants charged their lines, some men broke and ran, as would happen in any army facing such terror. But enough men held their ground that the formation didn't completely disintegrate, and that was sufficient. Carthaginian mercenaries, individually skilled and often very brave, lacked this systematic training and the unit cohesion it produced. When their formations broke under Roman pressure, or when elephants stampeded back through their lines, they couldn't reform and recover the way Roman legions could. This difference in military culture, more than any tactical or technological factor, ultimately determined the war's outcome. Rome could lose battles and return stronger because their military system could absorb defeats without collapsing. Carthage won brilliant tactical victories but couldn't translate them into strategic success because their mercenary system lacked the resilience of Rome's citizen army. The years following Agrigentum would test this resilience repeatedly. Rome would lose entire fleets to storms, suffering naval disasters that killed more men than all of Carthage's military victories combined. In 255 BC, a storm off Camarina would destroy 280 Roman ships and drown tens of thousands of sailors and marines. In 253 BC, another storm would destroy 150 ships off Cape Palinurus. In 249 BC, the Romans would lose nearly their entire fleet, 120 ships, to a combination of Carthaginian naval action and subsequent storms. Each time, Rome would rebuild, constructing new fleets, training new crews, and returning to the sea despite losses that would have convinced any rational power to abandon naval warfare entirely. This stubborn persistence, this refusal to accept defeat regardless of cost, was the true Roman weapon that Carthage couldn't counter. The elephants that had seemed so terrifying at Agrigentum were nothing compared to the grinding inevitability of Roman determination. Carthage could win battles, could inflict horrific casualties, could deploy every exotic weapon and tactic available, and still Rome would keep fighting. Eventually, Carthage's resources would be exhausted, while Rome's, drawn from all of Italy and its allies, would prove sufficient to sustain the war to its conclusion. The Battle of Agrigentum was the moment when this dynamic first became apparent, when both sides realized they were locked in a conflict that wouldn't end quickly or easily, that would require each power to commit fully to victory or accept humiliating defeat. Neither could accept defeat, so the war would continue until one side's capacity to resist was completely destroyed.